Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society, interviews with prominent authors and historians specializing in the colonial period. My name is Randy Flood, and joining me today is my colleague, Christian DeSpigna, author of Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. Now, this segment is brought to you by the Real American Revolution public television series and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education. So, Christian, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Thanks, Randy. Paul Lockhart is professor of history at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, where he teaches European, Scandinavian, and military history. Among his seven single-authored books are The Drill Master of Valley Forge, The Baron de Steuben and the Making of the American Army, and also The Whites of Their Eyes, Bunker Hill, The First American Army, and the Emergence of George Washington. He was formerly Brage Golding Distinguished Professor of Research at Wright State and was just named the 2020 Distinguished Historian by the Ohio Academy of History. His latest book, Firepower, How Weapons Shaped Warfare in the Age of the Gun, will be published by Basic Books later this year. Paul, welcome. It's a big thrill for us to have you here.
Well,
I just wanted to show the books that I had purchased many moons ago and was instrumental in my own research. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Terrific, terrific. Well, Paul, in your book, Whites of Their Eyes, you have you talk about Artemus Ward, and he's another neglected figure in this period of history. But you discuss him at really length in your book. Can you tell us about his real role at Bunker Hill and also his role in pulling together the Army?
Well, sure. You know, and this wasn't my, I don't want to turn this into a plug for Artemus Ward, but one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book is I felt bad for the man because he has not been well treated by academic historians who should know better. It's almost a punchline to a bad joke, and it doesn't help that Washington didn't like him. I think that's kind of the final curse. My wife joked about this. Well, when my book came out near the same time as Jim Nelson's book and just shortly before Nat Philbrick's book, which are all very close together. And my wife had pointed out that I chose the wrong hero. Perhaps I should have chosen the young widow doctor who was good looking with a bunch of kids, and instead I chose the overweight Puritan with bladder problems. And unfortunately, those are the things we remember about Ward. But to me, the hero of this story, or at least one of a group of heroes of this story in particular, the one that's been neglected the most, and for two main contributions that are both fairly broad ones. The bigger one being the fact that Ward supervises, not the only person obviously involved in this, but he supervises the creation and, more importantly, the maintenance of what becomes the First American Army. Just the act of taking that assemblage of men that emerges, from the countryside after the Lexington alarm, and manages to keep them there for the most part. I mean, granted, it's an army that's continually in flux, but keep them there, keep them housed, keep them fed, actually reasonably well fed, and create the infrastructure of an army essentially from scratch. So the fact that there is an army there to fight at Bunker Hill, and the fact that there's an army there to actually greet Washington when he shows up, is because Ward managed to do this. Is it an ideal army? Of course not. I mean, Washington cataloged all the problems that existed in it, and they're pretty damning. But without Ward, I can't imagine there even being that group there to meet Washington. And that is definitely a skilled administrator. And a great team to work with, and good relations with Joseph Warren, obviously, in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and that helped things a great deal. But he certainly deserves a great deal of credit for that. And when it comes to Bunker Hill, of course, he tends to get a fair amount of disapproval for that, which again I think is unfair. I remember Alan French, and Alan French's history is the one that probably ticked me off the most enough to write about Bunker Hill. And French had said, in order for his experiment to be a success, referring to the taking of the Charlestown Peninsula, Ward should have been bold. And first of all, the taking of Charlestown Peninsula was not Ward's experiment. It was an act of desperation and Ward had said specifically Bunker Hill, not Breed's Hill. He ends up having to make up for the mistake or the intentional disobedience of either Israel Putnam or William Prescott, which clearly forced Gage's hand and therefore the battle. But to me, Ward's great virtue and the reason that he is an indispensable man in 1775 was his conservatism and the fact that he was not a risk taker, that he husbanded his resources, that he understood the most important thing was to keep things going until this became an American war, until the Second Continental Congress came around to supporting New England's war. And so when it comes to Bunker Hill, he does what he can to help feed the fight. The fact that a good number of his intended reinforcements don't make it there has less to do with him and says really more about the quality of the colonels commanding Massachusetts provincial regiments in 1775. But the fact that he was looking at a bigger picture than just what's going on in Charlestown. Now, part of that neglect or diminishment of Ward's role, I think, has to do with the fact that we often think of, and traditionally we thought of Bunker Hill as being a battle that is fought on the Charlestown Peninsula, neglecting the fact that there is something very real going on at Roxbury at the same time. And that Ward not only had in mind the intelligence that the British were planning on attacking Roxbury the next day, but the fact that Gage was intentionally pushing hard on John Thomas's forces at Roxbury, specifically to set Ward off balance. So Ward had to be concerned about protecting Cambridge and about protecting Roxbury and not letting the day turn into the day that the revolution ended, which it could well have done had things been conducted differently. So to me, as I looked at this as in my background, primarily in European military history, I saw Ward as the man who kept Bunker Hill from turning into an absolute disaster. Granted, I don't mean again to make him the only person who does. There's obviously a good number of others. Stark, clearly, for example, is one of those men that keeps Bunker Hill from being a much shorter battle. But Ward in particular, the negative reaction to Ward over the years, I think, is really a disservice. And the third element I wanted to introduce besides that is the fact that, to me, Ward and especially tragic in light of the reception that he's gotten over the years, Ward he's the ideal patriot. He's not self-serving or self-seeking. There's nothing flashy about him. And yet, 2 days after the Lexington alarm, he rides from Shrewsbury to Cambridge alone while he's very sick and in a great deal of pain, not knowing what was there on the other side, as he did it anyway. There's a man who believed in his state and believed in the cause and believed in his nascent country and served them. Ward is one of those, not the only one by any means, one of those figures that, that whole generation of 75, Ward included, of course, that have just, kind of slipped out of the pantheon, unfortunately, or never made it into the pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think you did a great job of that in the book, Paul. But I wanted to piggyback on I know that was one of the reasons for you writing the book, but I also wanted you to discuss your revisionist nature of the battlefield narrative.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yes, exactly. That was there were a number of things that over the years kind of sat ill with me about the traditional narrative. Now, Bunker Hill, in a most broad aspect, is not a complicated battle. It's pretty simple. But there were things that just didn't make any sense to me as in particular, as I began to work more and more with 18th century European warfare. One of them was, for example, the fact that a minor issue that it's frequently pointed as being an unusually bloody battle, where really, in comparison to mid-18th century European battles, it's pretty much par for the course. It ranks up there with the major battles of Frederick the Great in terms of proportion of dead and proportion of wounded. In getting down to minor particulars, I wonder why it was that what arguably Gage's best combat commander, Percy, is not has not have anything to do apparently with the battle. And I realize he didn't like Howe and Howe didn't like him, but it turns out that he does. It's just that, again, he has more to do with Roxbury. But as I began to pick apart the pieces, there were a myriad little minor issues that added up to a different battle when you put them all together. So just without cataloging too much, I wanted to point out a couple of things that I thought were really needed to be addressed in a revisionist history of the battle, which is first of all the misrepresentation of the opposing forces. Bunker Hill is, to me, it's an important battle, not because it clearly isn't decisive. It doesn't end the siege of Boston. It doesn't end the Revolution. Of course, it ramps up the Revolution, obviously, in a significant way. But it's a very American battle, right? The underdog versus this great army, and of course, where it comes to a popular narrative of the Revolution, anyway, we tend to, I think, especially in popular history, we tend to gravitate towards kind of an American exceptionalist approach. For example, we want the British to simultaneously have the best army in the world, which it is not. I mean, if somebody gives you a choice of an army to have in 1775, it's probably going to be France, Austria, or Prussia. Granted, the British had a better way of projecting, were capable of projecting force in a way those other countries were not, thanks to the Navy. But it's not the best army in the world. At the same time, we want their commanders to be kind of ridiculous. And we want them to be the way that Cornwallis is in Mel Gibson's Patriot, right? They're so contemptuous of Americans that they deliberately do stupid things just to show how contemptuous of Americans they are. They're kind of foppish, and they're not familiar with fighting in the wilderness. They're confounded apparently with battles that are fought on anything more complicated than a manicured lawn or a tennis court. And all these things flew in the face of what I knew of the British Army, which was the British Army was probably, and if you've read Matthew Spring's book on, with dealing with bayonets only, what I'm talking about here, is probably the most capable of European armies in fighting the regular wars. They've been fighting the Scots. I mean, look at how they revised their tactics in dealing with the 45 uprising. And their fighting in North America had revealed the British Army to be kind of on the cutting edge of fighting a regular war. So this isn't a hidebound, overly traditional army. It's an army that's adaptable. And at the forefront of that movement in the 18th century are William Howe and Thomas Gage, who both like Americans, they respect Americans, they think a great deal of American martial virtues, and they're at the forefront of the light infantry movement in the British Army. So anyway, all those things together just seem to be that something must be wrong with the narrative, and the main things I think are these. First of all, the armies are both very, very green. Extraordinarily green. Sometimes and there's a lot of references, of course, to the rebel army having a fund of experience for the French and Indian wars, but it's not particularly helpful experience. I mean, the French and Indian War is fought primarily by British regiments, with provincial regiments playing a secondary role, and so who are the most combat capable men in the or experienced men in the army? It's more or less Putnam and Stark, and their command experience didn't transcend the company level. I mean, these men had never led an army before. Ward was an adjutant, in a provincial regiment. He knew how to do bookkeeping. The average soldier in any one of the provincial regiments had never seen a hostile Native American, let alone fired at one before. And all the indications seem to be that the majority of men in the American army had almost no experience with firearms, which kind of goes against the very traditional American narrative about ourselves. We're used to guns, right? Well, right. Sure, if you're from the Berkshires, but if you're from, anywhere within 100 miles of Boston, probably not. The British Army, equally raw, better trained, better organized, drilled, etc. But very, very few veterans, certainly amongst the enlisted, because Britain really hadn't engaged in a battle since 1760. Outside of some engagements in North America right after the 7 Years' War, but so both very green armies. The British having an advantage that comes from having institutional memory, et cetera, et cetera. Another point, of course, that struck me was the Howe versus Clinton debate. The common narrative was always that once the British discover the redoubt going up on Breed's Hill, that Clinton and Howe and Gage get together at Province House, and they discuss their options. And Clinton is always portrayed as being the bold one. Let's hit them at daybreak, and we'll send a force up the Mystic, and we'll cut them off at Charlestown Neck, and we'll have them in a bag. And then Howe, not being as enterprising as Clinton, certainly Howe was nowhere near as good about complaining about his past fortunes after his career was over as Clinton was. No, we should just land troops at the cross the Charles and land troops and figure out what to do then. And it's always been portrayed as Clinton as being this visionary who's saying, let's hit them now, where Clinton says, let's hit them at daybreak. Daybreak's already happened on the morning of the 17th. He's talking about hitting them the next day, when the British were already planning on attacking Roxbury, and it made sense. But in fact, I was just reading over French again this morning because I was looking for a specific quote, and the idea that Howe's ideas prevailed because they're more conservative, and but that Howe was a victim of the 18th century leisure. Just get them over whenever. As a result, this Council of War is over. Early mid-morning, and it's not till close to 1 o'clock that the army's ready to go. And having studied British amphibious operations, I began to think, if getting an army into boats with their ammunition, with their field pieces, with their rations cooked in less than 8 hours is slow, then what's fast? You can't just take the army and throw them across the Charles. They can't swim. And the fact that Howe managed to get together an amphibious operation in a matter of about 5-6 hours, to me, is absolutely remarkable. That he succeeded at this at all. But either way, it transforms the narrative from being Clinton is kind of pushed to the side, and Howe is the one who's so relaxed about the whole thing. He's not in a hurry. Howe is the one who's saying, let's do it now. Let's do it as soon as we can. And I think probably overall the wisest the wiser of him and Clinton. Again, here we're just I don't plan on cataloging everything, but another issue comes up with the two attacks versus three. Did the British attack the Americans twice or three times? In all the British sources, it's clear there are 2 assaults, and in American sources, it's fairly clear there are 3. Now, it sounds like a trivial issue, and I'll get to the import of that in just a minute, but you can see why the Americans thought there were 3, but clearly Howe only ordered 2. Neither were these frontal assaults, as has been told. Howe is not just so contemptuous of Americans that he's attacking them from the front. He's planning turning movements, which were all the rage of the 18th century. This is, you flank the enemy. Frederick the Great wins all the time, right? Or when he does win. So the first attack is an attack on the American left, and Stark makes sure that doesn't happen. That devolves especially on the American left between the light infantry who've been repulsed and then reform, and then the British Grenadiers attacking the rail fence. That turns into this really poorly organized impromptu attack that Americans perceive as being a second assault. Howe didn't order it, it just kind of happened. And then when that fails, Howe completely reassesses the situation and focuses on the redoubt and the breastwork right next to it, and sends his men in an assault column, which was a really kind of a tactical innovation of the 18th century, a relatively loosely ordered attack column. And that, of course, eventually works. But the 2 versus 3 thing matters when we're talking about Howe's generalship. Because if Howe's generalship is frontal assault, that doesn't work, let's do it again. Frontal assault, that doesn't work, let's do the same thing again. Frontal assault, okay, it works this time. As opposed to flanking movement doesn't work on the left, now let's try one on the right, and it works. It's the difference between an unimaginative, likely incompetent battlefield commander and somebody who's actually pretty much on the top of his game. And that's, I think Howe was very much on the top of his game. And in introducing yet another issue is that I think students of military history like soldiers' battles. They like to read about lions led by donkeys. I mean, this is the whole narrative of the First World War. We don't like to say the battle fails because the enlisted men failed. We like to blame officers. And yet what happens with the British Army is exactly the officers are the ones who are taking tremendous casualties because they're trying their damnedest to get the men into line and moving the way that veteran troops should, but they're not dealing with veteran troops. They're dealing with green men. And so it's really the Howe's frustration with the battle is very similar to Gage's and Percy's after Lexington and Concord. Our men didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't have the discipline that we count on, with British soldiers. So that those are 2 of the big things. The other one, which I already mentioned, of course, the fact that the battle isn't just Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. The battle is also Roxbury. And while that doesn't really have a huge impact on the combat around Charlestown, it explains a lot about Ward's generalship, about why he's so conservative. And it also reveals Gage, I think, as being a fairly clever tactician. Somebody who understood that just blunt force applied to the leftmost part of the overall American position is not going to be enough. That Roxbury really is the sensitive. It's it's the underbelly of the American position, and the fact that he presses on that, I think, is so all those things together. But as I said, there were just 1,000 little things that I found wrong with the established narrative that turned Bunker Hill into. I mean, they don't change the outcome of the battle, obviously, although I think they remind us that Bunker Hill was in fact a British victory and not an insubstantial one, in a tactical and strategic sense. But that perhaps the leading figures in it, Gage, Howe, Clinton, Ward, Stark, Prescott, Warren, Putnam aren't quite necessarily the kind of the cartoonish figures who are either heroes or villains or incompetents or geniuses that they come out as and being in the popular narrative.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, Paul, you just answered my question about Howe and Gage and the perspective of the leaders at that time. So really, Christian, why don't you go to our final question here about Warren's death being a huge blow to the Whigs?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? And really, I think people don't realize what a huge blow it was. But maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the British side of this whole incident of Warren's death and what their reaction was.
Well, the thing is that fascinated me about looking at that from the British perspective is that as how well known Warren was, and I understood that at least British leadership, and especially locally, especially Gage, et cetera, were well aware of Sam Adams, for example, because Sam Adams was fairly obnoxious, and that they were aware of Warren. But the fact that Howe, of course, gave him a great deal of credit. That remark he made about what he was worth in terms of in terms of numbers of men, to have him taken away from the cause. But also all that emerges around the desecration of Warren's body, which reflects a broader familiarity amongst British forces with who Warren was, and he had a reputation that clearly went beyond the realm of provincial politics in the spring and summer of 1775, and he was recognized as being, this kind of key instrumental figure in promoting the rebellion, which absolutely surprised me. I didn't think that within the British Army as a whole there was that much of an awareness of who Warren was, but clearly the most recognizable rebel, if you will, in Boston in 1775.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Look, before we go, can you give us a little sneak peek on the next book?
Oh yeah, sure. It's as you mentioned, called Firepower: How Weapons Shape Warfare in the Age of the Gun. I've been teaching on this topic for almost as long as I've been teaching college, and I've had a long interest in the history of tactics, obviously, but particularly the role of military technology and especially firearms technology. And firearms history is something I've dabbled with for years, and owing to the fact that my paternal grandmother worked both for Springfield Armory and for Remington, and besides making me memorize strange details about 18th century sailing rigs, because she came from a whaling family, she would recite to me how you field stripped a 1917 Browning water-cooled machine gun. She knew it reasonably well. But one thing that struck me in dealing with military history is that while very often academic historians outside of military history think that military historians are interested in nothing but what they see as the more sophomoric aspects of military history, which is guns and guns and glory, that so often our understanding of military history is diminished, I think, by a misunderstanding of how firearms actually affect the way armies fight. We see this in a really big way, for example, with World War I and with the American Civil War. And so that's the whole idea with this book, was to see look at the interplay between technological development of firearms in particular, from the Renaissance to the end of the Second World War. And the impact, both small and large, and the areas that don't have a big impact. For example, the relatively minor impact that poison gas has on combat in the First World War. Not a decisive weapon, although it's a memorable, iconic weapon. Or the way that, in particular, the Industrial Revolution has not just affected the mass production of weapons, but also the way in which research and development is done on weaponry, and the pace at which technological change proceeds, and for that matter, the politics of military technology. How, as the technology becomes more complex, the number of players in great power politics necessarily becomes more restricted, as lesser players are able to participate in that technological development. So that's essentially what I'm covering. It's the biggest topic that I've done by far, considering my last book was covered a battle a little bit more, and before that was a biography, and previous to that had been various histories of Denmark. But it's been a lot of fun to write it. Not as much fun as writing Whites of Their Eyes, which is probably the most fun I've had writing a book. Mm-hmm. But it's still having a great deal of fun with it. I just finished the next to last draft, so this will be coming out either at the end of this year or early next year.
Excellent. Well, we'd like to have you back. That's all the time we have today. That's all the time we have today for our discussion. But thanks, Paul. We really, really enjoyed it. You certainly led a unique insight into the battle of the strategy about Breed's Hill and what went on. So we hope you come
Thanks for giving me a chance to gab about it.
No, not at all. And really, if anyone hasn't read it, they really should pick up a copy of it. So
absolutely. Well, we hope you come back.
Well, I'm happy to.
And we'd to our viewers, we hope you've enjoyed this presentation with Paul Lockhart, historian and author. And on behalf of my colleague, Christian DeSpigna, we'll say goodbye for now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Randy.